Hi there, and happy Friday, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the weekly Bustle. Today, we are gonna go for another stitch in which me and Mudassir go down the rabbit hole of understanding institutional power and the rights of the government in trying to protect the sanctity of the country or the institution. Now, this topic is difficult for us to navigate as well, so we're trying our best to understand when is it okay for the government to oppress if that means it's beneficial for the majority of the country, and when is it okay for the government not to do so, and why are people not okay with government using this kind of a power, and how can we make sure that we provide an environment where governments can actually utilize this power for the beneficial of the majority or for the major population, but also do it in a way that the population does not feel threatened or suspicious of the government's actions. So it is going to be an intense and an interesting conversation. I am hoping you're going to love it. Without further ado, here's the first voice note.
So, if you've been following Pakistan's politics and the news revolving around it for the last few months or so, you'd know that there's been a conscious effort to curb freedom of speech. Mostly, it's happening to make sure that one party, which is PTI, although they don't have that name anymore, but the point is there's been a consistent effort from the establishment to make sure that their voices aren't heard. So much so that on the day of elections, the internet and mobile networks in general were closed down. Even now, X, which was formerly known as Twitter, is completely shut down. And the interesting part is that despite court orders, which clearly say that no social media app should be shut down, and they particularly mentioned about X, but the government doesn't care. Obviously, we all know that behind the scenes, it's all the establishment calling the shots. And the immediate reaction is that freedom of speech is a right for everyone. And no matter what circumstances are, no matter what's going on, there's no reason to curb freedom of speech. But then again, like this is something that I've mentioned in the podcast before as well, that this is the exercise which I like to do whenever I'm too confident about anything, or even if I'm not. What I try to do is I try to look at the other side, and I try to give myself very logical and whatever reason I can find to counter what I think about it. So what I thought was, in this case, which I just mentioned about Pakistan's politics, it obviously we all would agree that it's completely wrong. People should be allowed to support whoever they want to. It's okay if you think, if the court thinks, if the law thinks that person is a criminal, they should. Um, it's fine if they go to jail. Again, that's another debate. If whatever has happened to Imran Khan, is it legal or not? But that's the courts. That's for the courts to decide. But if the people support him, that's fine. But on the flip side, there's been occasions even within Pakistan where mobs have taken over the country, or what mostly happens is they come out for a dharna where they sit down and stay in the capital of the city, which is Islamabad, and they're a very violent mob. They're far right in politics, and their politics revolves around Khatme Naboot, which is a concept where anyone who doesn't oblige to their version of Islam and Khatme Naboot, they'll be okay in killing them. And the entire origin of that political party comes from this person who killed one of Pakistan's MNA. So they actually idealize him, and that's the thought was the thought came out when people uh, came out in huge numbers for the funeral of that person, which for most logical and progressive thinkers, or even centrist, I would say, they'd be outraged to know that a murderer is being celebrated. But they did come out, and they came out in numbers. So when these mobs take over capitals or just the streets in general, I think it's sometimes okay to turn off the internet, or just stop the mode of communication. Because at that point, you stopping freedom of speech might actually save lives. But obviously, now that I countered that point, I also think that when you give someone the right to stop it, or decide when to stop the communication from happening, or freedoms of speech to be curbed down, it's a very dangerous power to have. You cannot know that that person or that group of people will always decide in the benefit of the public at large. And even then, we can argue whether the decision to stop or allow freedom of speech should be in the hands of public at large, because we all know, and we've discussed this in the podcast many times, that the public at large sometimes does make mistakes. And if their mistake could cost thousands or hundreds of lives, that is a very, very high cost to pay. So this is an idea which I wanted to discuss, and I would love to know your thoughts on it, or what you think about it. So then we could have an interesting discussion, I thought, because I, currently I am confused between both sides of the argument. And if you've been following this voice all around, you know that even I'm undecided about it. But I think having this discussion would lead to something where at least the listener would be inclined to lean towards one way or the other, or just help them understand the topic better. So I'd love to hear what you think about it.
I really love the topic of, I would say, trade offs. So I like what you're talking about here. It's about freedom of speech. And when do you decide to curb the freedom of speech to do what? And in my head, even if you take out freedom of speech, the concept that you're defining is basically trade offs and the act of balancing, right? So, how far can you go without completely breaking the system? And that is an interesting point of view for me, because it's not like you don't have freedom of or the freedom to do stuff, right? For example, there's an example I give everybody all the time, right? So recently the elections happened here in Pakistan, and also we recently had elections in our group for fun, and in which one person said, I have a right not to vote. And I'm like, yeah, but you need to vote so that the system works. He's like, no, but it's my choice. I'm like, yeah, but do you have choice in paying taxes? No, you don't. The government takes away your choice. They're like, this is needed for the functionality of the government, for the government to function properly, right? So I also take this the same way, that freedom of speech is okay, but if freedom of speech comes into the functioning of the society at large, then you can have a debate about, is it worth it or not. And that's the whole debate that the left and the right is happening all over the world. The left is like, no, freedom of speech is important, but we need to also think about minorities and oppressed and underprivileged people, or like underprivileged parts of society, and then we need to be inclusive and everything. And the right is like, yeah, but it's my choice. I will say what I want to say. I will not curb my rights. I will not compromise from my side to make someone else feel better with it. And that's the whole point. And you're like now walking in a very thin thread of a balancing act. I said this before as well. This reminds me of the paradox of intolerance, right? A tolerant society by default needs to be a tolerant society, right? That's in the definition. But it can only exist as a tolerant society if it's only intolerant of one thing, which is intolerance. And it sounds like a mouthful, but what it is basically saying is, for a society to be peaceful, it needs to engage in war to make sure that the society stays peaceful, right? So if someone comes in and tries to disrupt your peaceful society, you will have to engage in war or engage in conflict with that conflicting party to make sure that the peace prevails in society, which is counterintuitive. You're like, but you're a peaceful party, you're a peaceful society. Why are you engaging in conflict? Yes, you're engaging in conflict to protect the peace in your society. And a lot of countries around the world have taken this to mean in a different context. Some people think it's not about your society, it's about the world at large, and I can go and invade things under the guise of democracy or peace. But that is the point that I think what I hear from you is saying, that you have freedom of speech, and it's fine. You have the right to express yourself, but you don't have the right to be away from the consequences of your actions, right? If you go as a mob and try to disrupt society at large, it is completely normal and understandable if someone, the government or the army, cracks down on you because you're disrupting the peace. Now, there's a separate debate that is the army and the government thinking for the people or they're thinking for themselves. That's a completely separate debate. Let's assume that for now they're a very nice functioning government and an army who thinks about people at large. So if one mob comes in and tries to threaten through religious extremism and tries to invoke fear in society, I think it's completely reasonable for a functioning government and army to step in, curb rights, because they want peace to prevail overall. And I know it is a shaky thing. You know why it's a shaky thing? Because recently I just watched a movie. I don't know if you did. It's called Chamkila. It's an Indian movie about this artist from Punjab who was killed at the age of 27 because he was singing very vulgar songs. But the thing is, he was singing vulgar songs because the people wanted him to sing vulgar songs. They were enjoying it. His concerts were sold out all the time. He got threatened by he was sick, so he got threatened by some sick separatists and militants that stop singing these songs. You're tainting society and you're basically destroying the peace in our society. You're making them dirty and bad. And he's like, I'm not doing anything. Everyone is doing it. I just became famous doing it. All little artists do it, but what should I do? The people wanted. They're like, no, you need to stop. Then he stopped. He's like, okay, I fear for my life. I'll stop. But he stopped and he used to go to every concert, but people would still ask for it. Like, no, I mean, he went into religious singing, but the people asked for it. Come on, please, please, the old songs for fun. And then he gave in and he started singing the old songs again. And again, he got a threat saying that you need to stop now because we are the caretakers of society. And this is a militant group. And they're deciding for society at large. Well, society actually wants this thing. They're like, we want to have fun. We want to listen to these vulgar songs. We want to have fun. This gives us joy. And society and these militant groups and separatist groups are like, no, we decide what is good for the Sikh society. We decide what is helpful for people at large. The people don't know. We need to hold their hand. And they're curbing this person's individual right to express themselves and sing their songs, and also curbing the people's right to be able to listen to these songs. So, is that okay or not? That's the question, right? Is it okay for a certain type of group of people to make a decision for the whole of the population at the cost of some of the population to make sure that the population at large gets to live in peace? And this becomes a bit more nuanced. So I want your opinion now on this. That is it just about majority and minority? How will you include inclusiveness into this to make sure that it's not just the majority party getting most of the benefits from curbing the speech while the minority gets left out? These are the questions I have in my head that I don't have an answer to. But I hope this is a good conversation, the rolling of the conversation that I can pass to you and see what thoughts do you have in your head.
I think before we even talk about freedom of speech or whether or not it should be curbed or who gets to decide that, I think what your voice note made me realize was there's this lack of trust that exists between government and the people, and it's the same with all countries. I think even developed countries have seen it in history that there have been some extreme events. The like they've gone into wars and the people have been frustrated about it because eventually they've lost their livelihoods. There've been recessions because of it, and all sorts of extreme events. But so yeah, so them being misled has increased the lack of trust between government and the people. So when they do take measures like curbing freedom of speech, for example, people do tend to have this thought that maybe it's some sort of controversy theory that starts circulating around, and there are reasons for the people to trust it. And obviously most countries that we're talking about, barring a few, are democracies, right? So there will always be the opposition's voice that will tell you a counter narrative that makes the government's narrative look bad. So regardless of what they do, and even if they're doing it for the best interest of the people at large, you will have reasons to doubt it. So I think first we need to talk about ways to bridge that gap between government and the people. Uh, One might think, and this is something we've discussed a lot of times in our previous podcast, that we hope that this information age would make fake news a lot harder to trust. It will lead people to understand what the right thing is, like these flat earthers and calling COVID a hoax and stuff like that wouldn't exist, but it does. So I think we need to move towards making things more objective. Today we have proper researches, we have numbers for everything. I think we need to find ways that these debates that happen between government and the opposition are more objective. I get it that there will always be the factor that where people would have their own opinions and they wouldn't be backed with numbers at all times. But maybe on our level at least we can ask ministers of our areas, or just do things that make them debate with proper facts and not something that they would promise and they don't know if that would happen or not. So like this is something which is probably would be done in the long run, but I do think in the short run, um, if the government is trying to take measures that they do think is for the betterment of the people, and these measures could be against the fundamental rights like freedom of speech that we're talking about, it's, I think, very important for them, for their own good and for the good of the people, that after they do it, they come on and tell us whether it was successful or not, or if they hadn't done that, uh, what problems would have existed. So I'm sorry with all, because you might be hearing all this noise, but you're aware that this is the time where I try to walk and then find out time to continue these stitches. So yeah, what I was saying is, uh, if there is this transparency that exists, where these government officials, these MNAs, come um, on in these press conferences and stuff, and tell the people that their measures, and obviously there are certain measures which are like law changes and stuff like that. These are obviously debated in the parliament, but even outside it, I think taking people into consideration on a daily basis or a policy wise basis is very very helpful. So I think this is one thing that can be worked on, but I still think that on the problem that, like, even if we imagine a perfect world, the problem of curbing freedom of speech would still exist. And if we're talking about that, we're still struggling to understand where, on what occasion is it helpful to stop freedom of speech, and would it actually lead to results, or does it on the in the long run, and if we're comparing the two sides, it's actually more harmful. So I think the problem still exists, but what is important is we're making we find ways to make it more transparent, is what I'm trying to say.
I understand where you're coming from, and I understand the transparency element of it. To be honest, when you were talking about stuff about bridging a connection, the first thing that came into my head was, okay, we need more transparency. They need to come out and tell about the decisions that worked, decisions that didn't work, because at the end of the day, you're not gonna punish them for taking the wrong decision if the decision was well thought out, right? That's how I always believe, that if it's a deep decision making process, and then the decision doesn't come in your favor, that is perfectly fine. That is life. Sometimes it's a game of probabilities, and you try your best, especially on a macroeconomic scale such as economics and, for example, COVID, where you don't know what you're working with. It is a trade-off. It is probabilities. So you will try your best with the incomplete information that you have, and you try to make your best. And if it works your way, that's great. If it doesn't work your way, as long as the process was clear, transparent, and open, then I think it's perfectly fine. And I think that's something I completely agree with you. However, on the topic of how to, like, why the lack of trust is and how we can bridge it further besides transparency, the example that came into my head was how the digital minister of Taiwan basically holds public office hours every week, where she goes online on Facebook, their kind of Facebook or something, and then she takes questions from the public and she tries to answer it. Ironically, she was an activist herself before she became the digital minister of Taiwan, so she was all for transparency and everything. And now she's trying her best to keep those lines of communication open. And I think that's the crux of the matter. The lack of trust between the people and the government only exists because there is lack of communication. The people in the parliament, the people who are making the policies are so in their own bubble and like in their own ivory tower. They don't know what the common person might be going through. They don't know what's happening. Your local ministers do know what's happening, but the local ministers also are quite far away from the parliament and the people who are making the policy decisions. And that's the interesting bit. It's that you are trying to build this hierarchical structure so that you can have like you can say more ease of control and more centralization, but that makes you sometimes not the right person to be making decisions for the people as a whole, because you have no idea what's happening on the ground level. And yes, you have people who should be reporting that information to you, but for some reason that information doesn't come to you, and we the public don't know why. So I think I completely resonate with that topic. However, on the topic of information age, I think I would disagree with you, because on the information age, I don't agree that we should have objective information. I think this is quite natural that we're having more disinformation due to the democratization of information. Because now, if you give everyone the control to build their own narratives, you can imagine that there will be multiple different narratives. And that is the issue as well, that does it make sense that everyone gets a say? Especially people who are making a lot of claims that they cannot be backed up by objective truth, but in certain cases they can be, because even the objective truth is not objective anymore, Mudassir. That is the interesting thing. I'll give you a good example. We talk about numbers and health, like data and all of that stuff, right? But a lot of data, medical data, is basically also skewed and incorrect. There was a recent research that came out that I think I told you about it. 1 in 10 or 1 in 5, so that's between 10 and 20% of all research papers that came out were biased and had sampling errors or outright fraud. The numbers were mushed on purpose to basically fit the narrative and the hypothesis of what the researcher wanted the result to be. So even those researchers that we try to look forward to and look up to, that these are scientists using the scientific method, may also have smudged the numbers. So what do you trust anymore? And that is exactly why disinformation exists, because if you go to, like, let's take health for an example, because it's a very good example. If you go online, you'll find people who are all about science and healthy living and everything and medicine and how it works. And a lot of people are like holistic, and they're like, no, look at the research. This processed food is so bad for you. The medical system is designed to put you in the hospital and then charge you shitloads of money. And that's what the American diet is also about. It's about getting you to the hospital so you can pay for American healthcare. And you're like, but that doesn't make sense. Why would for-profit companies go through this? And apparently they do, according to these people. So even objective numbers are not correct enough in my eyes. I think going back to the main point about freedom of speech, or any decision a government makes, or anything a person does, lines of communication need to be open. And I think that is the only thing I can make that makes sense in my head, that would make it a bit more digestible. That if a decision is made by the government, they come out, they hold open town halls where anyone who's interested can either dial in online, or the people who are representatives go there physically, and then you can watch your representative there. You can have a direct line of communication with your representative, tell them what you think about the matter, and then your representative can decide, okay, do they want to raise that topic in the town hall or not? Because that makes that's the beauty of digitalization. The scale is nice. The scale can be used in your favor, but for some reason we don't want to do scaling. We want to stick to the arbitrary methods of the past. A good example of this would be when I just recently was trying to again apply for a visa for my family to come here. And in certain countries, in certain cities, the process is online. You just fill up a form and you press submit, and then you get a form, and then you print out that form, or you send it to them, and they print it out, and then they submit it with their visa application. But I had to fill out the form, print it, go out, get it stamped physically at the town hall, and then now I have to scan it or take a picture of it before sending it back. And the funny part about printing was that I tried to look around in my city to find printers, and none of them were working. So because not many people print anymore. This anecdote of a side anecdote is only to make sense about my argument for digitalization. That governments and general public bodies are very slow in digitization. And I think that's also an addition to the point that if you digitize properly, like how the example of the digital minister of Taiwan, you might be able to enhance the lines of communication with the public at large and build the trust that is slowly eroding away from your institutions.
I think you make a good point about researches being skewed. I wouldn't call them incorrect because the thing is, every research, no matter how much you want to make it unbiased, has this element of biasness because it's being done by humans who have certain outlooks about the world and how they view things. So it does come into the research itself. So how you view these researches is different. I know for an average human, and right now we're talking about freedom of speech and how that data can be used to best use the freedom of speech in general. So I understand that it's very hard to do, but I think viewing researches as tools to get to a goal is more important rather than focusing on particular researches that are telling you certain kinds of results. So when you look at multiple researches and when you look at how those methods are to get to the point where whatever claim that that research is making is also very important. So if you look at multiple researches and obviously credibility is also very important. So when we look at all of this together, I think it's a better picture that we can get. But yeah, I also understand that when you're talking about the whole population, I don't think like even researches in general are so vague, and you can even when they're saying a certain thing, you can choose to interpret it in a certain way because that's just how these current leaders are doing, using information whatever way they want to and twisting the narrative in the way they like it to. So yeah, I do feel there is a skepticism and valid skepticism that revolves around it. Uh, but I also think that these numbers and the effects of whatever decisions you are making, and obviously we're talking about freedom of speech, so that is very, very important when you shut down the internet or control whatever way of communication that you're controlling. It's important that you tell what you were trying to do. Even if you skew the numbers, it's important that the results of it and what you gain through it should be shared with the public at large. So I'm not saying that this solution is perfect and like a magic wand that would solve everything, but it's still a step up because we know that regardless of how much we like it or dislike it, these things will continue to happen. There will be governments that will curb freedom of speech, and then there will be other governments where they would like allow all sorts of extremes. And we can talk about this separately as well because I think that's a whole different topic that blasphemy, it's in these Western countries, should that be allowed or should that be curbed? For them, they use it uh, as examples of how much freedom of speech they're allowing, and it can have other very, very damaging effects in the countries like Pakistan. So it's again a nuanced topic, but I also think that um, again that you should be able to know what results you're getting, and like I always say that these conversations should continue to happen, and the more information there will be there for the public to debate,
Whatever happens in the debate is a different thing, but I think more information given to the public would always have net results that are better for them rather than being bad. So, yeah, that's what I think about sharing these researches.